What happens when a man, broken by grief and teetering on the edge of ruin, makes a choice born of pure desperation? In the unforgiving heart of the West, a cowboy widower with a heartbroken daughter goes to the train station to collect a mail-order bride he didn't order. He finds a woman left on the platform, rejected and branded too old. In that moment, with nothing left to lose, he makes a proposal that will either save them both or shatter their lives completely. This isn't just a love story, it's a story of survival, of two lost souls bound by a desperate pact in a land that swallows hope whole. Stay with us as we unravel this tale of grit, grief, and the unexpected kindness that can bloom in the harshest of landscapes. The silence of the house was a living thing. It coiled in the corners of the single-room sod-roofed cabin, clung to the rough-hewn furniture, and settled like a fine layer of dust over Jedediah's soul. It had been a year, 2 months, and 11 days since Mary's laughter had last echoed off these walls. A year since the world had shrunk to the size of a small, hand-carved headstone on a windswept hill. Jedediah Hale was a man whittled down by grief and hardship. His face, weathered by the relentless Texas sun and wind, looked older than his 32 years. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a permanent squint, not just from the prairie glare, but from the constant, inward bracing against a pain that never seemed to dull. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had learned that wasted energy was a luxury he could not afford. His ranch, a modest spread of sun-scorched earth and struggling cattle near the edge of the Llano Estacado, was failing. The creek had run low for 2 seasons straight, turning the once promising grasslands to a brittle, yellowed mat. His small herd of longhorns, already thinned by a harsh winter, grew leaner by the day. Every morning he'd ride out, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, and survey the cracked earth, the shimmering heat haze, and the vast, indifferent sky. It was a land that demanded everything and gave back only what it pleased, and lately it had not been pleased. But the ranch's decay was a slow, creeping rot compared to the gnawing emptiness in his home. The silence was his constant companion, broken only by the mournful lowing of a distant cow or the soft, hesitant movements of his 6-year-old daughter, Sarah. Sarah was the living, breathing embodiment of his loss. She had her mother's fiery red hair, a startling banner of life against the muted browns and greys of their world. But she had lost her mother's smile. In its place was a solemnity. She would sit for hours by the window, her small face a mask of quiet longing, watching the horizon as if expecting her mother to walk back over it. Jedediah tried. Lord, how he tried. He cooked lumpy porridge and burned the bread. He clumsily rebraided her hair each morning, his calloused fingers fumbling with the silken strands. He told her stories at night, his voice a low rumble. But the tales were of lonely cowboys and lost calves, tinged with a melancholy he couldn't shake. He was a father, and he loved her with a fierce, protective ache, but he could not be her mother. He could not fill the void Mary had left, a void that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. The breaking point had come a week ago. He'd found Sarah in the lean-to, curled in the hay, shivering despite the heat, her face tear-streaked. She had been talking to one of the milk cows, her voice a tiny, desperate plea. "Mama cow," she'd whispered. "Where did my mama go? Does she miss me?" The sight had shattered what little composure Jedediah had left. It was a raw, undeniable truth. Sarah needed a woman's touch, a mother's care, and he, with his clumsy hands and broken heart, was failing her. The ranch needed a woman's hand too, The garden was overrun with weeds, the mending was piled high, and the sheer volume of work required to keep their small world from crumbling was more than one man could bear. That night, unable to sleep, he'd sat at the small table, the yellow light of the kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows. He'd pulled out the worn copy of the Matrimonial Monitor, a catalogue he'd picked up in Fort Sumner on a whim months ago, a morbid curiosity at the time. He had scoffed at the idea then, at the notion of buying a wife like a sack of flour. It felt like a betrayal of Mary, of the love they had shared, a love born of shared dreams and stolen glances, not a transaction in a catalogue. But desperation was a powerful acid, dissolving principles and pride. He scanned the pages, his gaze skimming over the hopeful, smiling faces of young women from the East, women seeking adventure, security, a husband. They were all so young, so full of life. The thought of bringing one of them here, to this house of grief and struggle, felt like a cruelty. He had almost thrown the paper into the cold hearth when his eyes landed on a small, discreet advertisement near the back. It was not for a woman, but for a service. The Prairie Rose Introduction Agency. It promised discreet and reliable placements for discerning gentlemen and respectable ladies. It felt slightly less like a cattle market, though he knew it was functionally the same. He wrote the letter by the flickering lamplight, his words stark and unadorned. He was a widower with a 6-year-old daughter. He owned 300. He sealed the envelope, a bitter taste in his mouth, and sent it off with a freight driver the next morning, feeling like he had just signed away a piece of his soul. A reply had come faster than he'd expected, a terse, businesslike letter from the agency. A suitable match had been found, a Miss Audrey Miller, arriving from Philadelphia. The letter stated she was 35 years of age, a governess by trade, of sober and industrious character. She was to arrive on the 10 o'clock train in dusty, sun-baked Endurance, the nearest town of any consequence, on the 10th of June. He hadn't told Sarah. He didn't know how. How could he explain that he was bringing a stranger to live with them? Her face was calm, but for the fine lines around her eyes and mouth, etchings of worry and a life spent observing rather than participating. The letter from the Prairie Rose Introduction Agency had been her last, desperate gamble. The family she had worked for nearly 2 decades had moved to England, their children grown, and her services were no longer required. She was left with a modest severance, a letter of recommendation, and the terrifying prospect of a future spent as a charity case, a spinster aunt living on the sufferance of distant relatives. The advertisement had promised a new life, a chance to build something of her own. The man she had been matched with, Mr. Silas Croft, was described as a prosperous rancher, a pillar of the community in Endurance, Texas. His letter, penned in a confident flowing hand, spoke of a large, comfortable home, of a need for a mature and steadying influence, and of his desire for a partner to share in his success. He was a widower, he'd written, with no children. The photograph he sent showed a handsome, silver-haired man with a proud bearing and a well-tailored suit. For Audrey, it seemed a respectable, if unromantic, solution. She did not expect love. She had long ago packed away such youthful notions with her mother's lace handkerchiefs. What she hoped for was security, a home, and a measure of respect. She sold most of her meager belongings, packed her 2 sturdy trunks with practical clothing, books, and the few keepsakes she possessed, and boarded the train west. The journey was a relentless assault on her senses. The clatter and sway of the railroad car, the ever-changing landscape that morphed from green, rolling hills to vast, flat plains of brown and gold. The sheer, overwhelming emptiness of it all. It was a world away from the crowded, ordered streets of Philadelphia. By the time the train finally chugged into the station at Endurance, she was weary to her bones, her sensible grey dress covered in a fine film of dust. Endurance. The name seemed a cruel joke. The town looked as if it were clinging to life by its fingernails, a single dusty street lined with ramshackle wooden buildings baked under a merciless sun. A hot, dry wind whipped dust and grit into the air, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. She stepped down from the train, her hand tightening on the handle of her reticule, and scanned the platform. A few cowboys in dusty Stetsons and worn leather chaps stared at her with open curiosity. A woman traveling alone was a novelty. A woman of her age, dressed in city clothes, was an event. Then she saw him. Silas Croft. He matched his photograph, but in person, his pride seemed to have curdled into arrogance. He waited for her to approach him, a small king holding court on his wooden platform. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Audrey walked towards him, her back straight, her expression composed. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am Miss Audrey Miller." Silas Croft looked from her to his companions, a shared smirk passing between them. He then turned his full attention back to her, his eyes cold and appraising, like a man inspecting livestock. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the platform to hear, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding." Audrey's heart gave a painful lurch. "A misunderstanding?" "Indeed," Croft said, gesturing vaguely at her. "The agency's correspondence was, shall we say, misleading. I was led to expect someone younger, someone more suited to the rigors of a new life." He practically spat the word, younger. The meaning was brutally clear. The blood drained from Audrey's face, but she held his gaze, refusing to crumple under the weight of his public humiliation. The heat of 100 suns seemed to be boring into her cheeks. The cowboys had stopped their chatter. The station master paused, his broom still. All eyes were on her. She was a spectacle, the too old bride, left at the station. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts, "my age was clearly stated in my letter, 35. "A number on a page is one thing, madam," Croft sneered, enjoying his performance. "The reality is quite another. I require a wife, not a chaperone. You are, to be blunt, too old for my purposes." Each word was a physical blow. The secure future she had dared to hope for evaporated in the harsh Texas sunlight. She was stranded, thousands of miles from anything familiar, with 2 heavy trunks and a dwindling supply of money. The hope that had sustained her through the long journey curdled into a cold, hard knot of despair in her stomach. She saw the pity in the eyes of some, the cruel amusement in others. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. But years of maintaining her composure in the face of spoiled children and demanding employers had forged a spine of steel within her. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. She lifted her chin. "I see," she said, her voice a chill wind. "Then you, sir, are a man of no honor. You have broken a contract and have wasted my time. I will thank you to have my trunks removed from the platform. I shall find my own accommodations." Croft let out a short, ugly laugh. "Accommodations? In Endurance? For a woman of your vintage? Good luck with the train." Her last link to the world she knew let out a final mournful whistle and began to chug slowly away from the station, leaving her utterly and completely alone on the platform. A woman rejected, abandoned, and branded. And it was in that moment of absolute desolation that she felt another presence nearby. She didn't look up at first, too consumed by her own humiliation, but then a quiet voice, rough around the edges like worn leather, cut through her despair. "Mom," the voice said, "that man, Silas Croft, he's a rattlesnake in a fancy suit. You're better off without him." Slowly, Audrey turned her head. Standing a few feet away was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very dust and hardship of this land. His clothes were worn, his face was etched with sorrow, and his eyes held a storm of their own. He was watching her, not with pity, but with a strange, unsettling flicker of understanding. It was Jedediah Hale, and he had seen everything. For a long moment, they just stood there, two islands of stillness in the swirling dust of the station platform. Audrey, rigid with a pride that was all she had left, and Jedediah, rooted to the spot by a potent mix of pity, anger, and a startling, unwelcome thought that had just begun to take shape in his mind. He had watched the entire brutal exchange. He knew Silas Croft by reputation, a man who bought up land from struggling ranchers who used his wealth and influence like a club. Seeing Croft's casual cruelty firsthand ignited a slow burn of anger in Jedediah's gut. But it was the woman who held his attention. He had seen her chin lift, had heard the tremor of steel in her voice as she confronted Croft. She hadn't wept or pleaded. She had stood her ground with a dignity that shamed the man who had tried to strip her of it. He saw not an old, discarded woman, but a survivor. And survival was something Jedediah Hale understood. "He's right about one thing," Jedediah said, his voice low and direct, breaking the silence. "There ain't much in the way of accommodations for a single lady in endurance." Audrey finally met his gaze fully. Her grey eyes were like chips of granite, hard and unyielding. "I am more resourceful than I may appear, sir." "I don't doubt it, ma'am," he replied, taking a half-step closer. He took off his sweat-stained Stetson, a gesture of respect that felt foreign and clumsy to him. He held it in his hands, turning the brim over and over. "Name's Jedediah Hale." "Audrey Miller," she replied, her voice clipped. She was waiting for him to leave, to let her be with her humiliation in peace. But Jedediah didn't leave. The reckless idea that had sparked in his mind was now a roaring fire. It was insane. It was through that same agency. The prairie rose. Audrey's composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief, then fresh pain crossed her features. "You were expecting a bride?" "No, ma'am," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I was the one who wrote. I'm a widower. I have a daughter, 6 years old, and a ranch that's, well, it's struggling." He was laying his cards on the table, every last one of them bleak. "I need help. My daughter Sarah, she needs a mother." He paused, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I'm not Silas Croft. I don't have a big fancy house. What I have is a sod-roof cabin, a mountain of debt, and a whole lot of hard work. I can't offer you silks or parties. I can offer you a roof over your head, food on the table, plain as it may be, and my name, my protection for what it's worth." Audrey stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. This was not a proposition she could have imagined in her wildest dreams or her worst nightmares. "What are you saying, Mr. Hale?" "I'm saying, Miss Miller," he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, "that we're two people in a bind. You need a home. I need a wife. It wouldn't be a marriage of the heart. I can't promise you that, my heart. It's buried on a hill overlooking my land. But I can promise you respect, and I can promise you'll never be left on a train platform again." He swallowed hard. "Marry me, Miss Miller, today." The audacity of it left her speechless. Marry this stranger? This sad-eyed, dust-covered man with his litany of troubles? It was madness. It was the most undignified, desperate act she could imagine. And yet, What was her alternative? To beg for a room at the saloon? To use her last few dollars to buy a ticket back east, back to a life of genteel poverty and pitying looks? She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the raw honesty in his stormy eyes. He wasn't trying to trick her or impress her. He was laying his desperation bare, just as hers had been laid bare for the entire town to see. He spoke of respect, a commodity that had just been stolen from her in the most public way possible. "You have a daughter," she said, her mind seizing on the most important detail. "Sarah?" he confirmed with a nod. She misses her ma something fierce. She won't be easy." "And your wife?" Audrey asked softly. A shadow passed over Jedediah's face, a deep, profound grief that was plain to see. "Mary. The fever took her last spring." In his grief, Audrey saw a truth she could cling to. This man had loved. He was not a cold, heartless man like Silas Croft. He was a broken man, and in a strange way, that made him. Audrey's gaze drifted from Jedediah's earnest, worried face to her two trunks sitting forlornly on the platform. They contained everything she owned in the world. Behind them, the town of Endurance shimmered in the heat, offering nothing but scorn and hardship. She then looked back at Jedediah Hale. He was offering a chance, a bleak, difficult, uncertain chance, but a chance nonetheless. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. The choice was between a slow, dignified starvation of the soul back east or a fight for survival here, in this brutal, unforgiving land, with this broken, honest man. "All right, Mr. Hale," Audrey said, her voice quiet but firm. "I accept your proposition." Relief washed over Jedediah's face, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't. I'll do my best to be a good husband to you." "And I, Mr. Hale," she replied, "will do my best to be a good wife and a mother to your daughter." There was no joy in their agreement, no spark of romance. It was a treaty signed on a battlefield of personal disasters. "The preacher's office is just down the street," Jedediah said, gesturing. "We can get it done before he closes for the day, then we can go home." He hired a boy to load Audrey's heavy trunks onto a wagon he rented from the livery stable. As they walked the short distance down the dusty main street, people stared. Whispers followed them like a cloud of flies. They knew. The whole town had seen her rejection, and now they saw her walking with the struggling widower, Jedediah Hale. Audrey kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back a steel rod. The preacher was a weary-looking man with a tobacco-stained beard. He eyed them over his spectacles, his expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. Frontier weddings were often strange, hurried affairs, but this one felt particularly grim. He asked the perfunctory questions. Jedediah and Audrey gave their responses in low, clear voices. They signed the ledger that made them man and wife. There was no ring. There were no flowers. There were no well-wishes. Just the scratching of a pen, a mumbled blessing from the preacher, and the heavy, binding silence of a pact being sealed. They walked out of the office into the harsh afternoon sun, husband and wife, strangers. "Mrs. Hale," Jedediah said, the name sounding foreign on his tongue as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Mr. Hale," she replied. The ride to the ranch was a long one, conducted in near total silence. The landscape was vast and intimidating. Audrey saw the cracked earth, the sparse vegetation, the endless sky. She saw the reality of the life. Soon she would be in his house, in Mary's home. The betrayal he felt was a sharp, physical pain. He was doing this for Sarah, he told himself again and again. It was the only way to justify the cold, hard knot of guilt in his own stomach. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the plains, a small, lonely cabin came into view. It seemed impossibly small and bleak, huddled against the vast emptiness. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. "That's it," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "Home." And standing in the doorway, a small, defiant figure with a shock of bright red hair, was a little girl. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth was set in a thin, unhappy line. Sarah. She had been waiting. And as the wagon rolled to a stop, her eyes fixed on Audrey, her gaze filled with a cold, instant, and unwavering hostility. The bargain had been struck, the vows had been said, but Audrey's trial had only just begun. The first few weeks of their marriage were a quiet, brutal war, fought with silence and averted gazes. The Hale cabin, which had once felt empty, was now suffocatingly full of unspoken things. Grief, resentment, and the awkwardness of strangers forced into the most intimate of arrangements. For Audrey, the reality of her new life was harsher than she could have imagined. The cabin was clean, but threadbare. The floor was packed earth. The wind found its way through a dozen small cracks in the sod walls, carrying with it a constant whisper of dust. The work was relentless, a dawn-to-dusk battle against entropy. She cooked on a temperamental wood stove, hauled water from the nearly dry creek, tended the pathetic, weed-choked vegetable garden, washed clothes with harsh lye soap that reddened her hands, and mended Jedediah's worn shirts by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp. It was a life of unending labor, but the physical hardship was nothing compared to the emotional desolation. Jedediah was a ghost in his own home. He treated her with a formal, distant courtesy that was more chilling than outright anger. He spoke only when necessary, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "The stew is good, ma'am. I'll be out on the North Range today. Thank you for mending the shirt." He never called her Audrey. She was always Mom. At night, the cabin shrank to the size of the small loft where Audrey slept on a narrow cot, separated from him by a threadbare curtain. Jedediah slept below on the main bed he had once shared with Mary. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Audrey would hear him sigh, a sound so laden with sorrow it made her own heart ache. She was the intruder, the constant, living reminder. The child was a tiny, ferocious guardian of her mother's memory. She refused to speak to Audrey. She would not even look at her. If Audrey addressed her, Sarah would turn her back, her small shoulders rigid with defiance. She would pointedly talk to her father as if Audrey wasn't in the room. "Papa, can you get me a drink of water? Papa, will you read me a story?" Audrey's attempts at kindness were rebuffed, with a coldness that was startling in a child. She baked a small molasses cake, a treat that had always won over her charges in Philadelphia. Sarah took one look at it, pushed it away, and said, "My mama made better cakes." Audrey mended the child's favorite doll. Sarah took the doll and promptly ripped the new stitches out. One afternoon, Audrey found Sarah standing by the small, rough-hewn bookshelf. The child was holding a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, the book Mary had brought with her from back east. Sarah couldn't read the words, but she held it like a sacred relic. "Your mother had fine taste in books," Audrey said softly, trying to find some common ground. Sarah slammed the book shut and glared at Audrey, her blue eyes so like her father's, blazing with fury. "Don't you talk about my mama?" she spat, her voice trembling. "You're not my mama. You're just the lady who cooks." She then ran from the cabin, slamming the door behind her, and didn't return until Jedediah found her hours later hiding in the barn. That night, Jedediah spoke to her at length for the first time. His voice was strained. "Ma'am, you have to understand. The girl is grieving." "I do understand, Mr. Hale," Audrey replied, her own voice tight. "I am not trying to replace her mother. I am simply trying to live here." "Just give her space," he said, before retreating back into his wall of silence. Audrey felt a despair so profound it was a physical weight. She was failing. She was failing to reach the child, failing to breach the husband's grief, failing to make this hollow shell of a house into any kind of home. The loneliness was more acute than any she had ever known, a sharp, piercing ache that the endless prairie sky seemed to magnify. But Audrey Miller was not a woman who broke easily. Years of servitude had taught her patience. She stopped trying to win Sarah over with overtures of kindness. Instead, she began a campaign of quiet competence. She did not just cook, she learned the quirks of the stove, and soon the bread was no longer burned, the stews rich and savory. She tackled the garden with a methodical fury, her governess's sense of order translating surprisingly well to rows of beans and squash. She discovered a patch of wild mint by the creek and made a soup. Jedediah noticed. He didn't comment on the ledgers, but he stopped leaving them in a messy pile. He would find them neatly stacked on the table each morning. He noticed the garden beginning to flourish under her care. He noticed the small, almost imperceptible changes that made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a place where people lived. A jar of wildflowers on the table, a clean, mended curtain over the window. He said nothing, but he watched her, his gaze lingering for a second longer than before. A small breakthrough came one sweltering afternoon. Sarah was playing near the barn when she stumbled, her hand landing squarely on a cactus. She let out a piercing shriek of pain. Jedediah was miles away, checking a fence line. Audrey ran outside to find the child sobbing, her small palm peppered with dozens of tiny, vicious spines. Without a word, Audrey scooped her up and carried her inside. Sarah fought her, kicking and screaming. "No, let me go! I want my papa!" "Be still, child," Audrey said, her voice firm but not unkind. She sat Sarah on a stool and, ignoring her struggles, held her hands steady. With a pair of tweezers she kept for mending, she began the slow, painstaking process of removing the spines. Her touch was steady and sure. With each spine she removed, she dabbed the spot with a cool, damp cloth. Sarah's sobs slowly subsided into hiccups, then silence. She watched Audrey's focused, gentle work, her tear-filled eyes wide with a grudging respect. When the last spine was out, Audrey wrapped the girl's hand in a clean strip of cloth. "There," she said softly. "It will be sore for a while, but it will heal." She released the child's hand. Sarah stared at her for a long moment, then slid off the stool and ran to her corner of the cabin without a word. But she didn't undo the bandage. When Jedediah returned that evening, he found them in the middle of their usual silent supper. He noticed the bandage on Sarah's hand immediately. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. "I fell," Sarah mumbled, her gaze on her plate. "On a cactus." "Did you get the spines out?" he asked, looking from Sarah to Audrey. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she said, very quietly, "She did." It was the first time she had referred to Audrey as anything other than an absence. It was a tiny crack in the wall of ice, but it was there. Later that evening, as Audrey was washing the dishes, Jedediah came and stood beside her. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for taking care of her." "It is my duty, Mr. Hale," she replied, not looking at him. "No," he said. "It was kind." It was a single word, but it was more than he had given her in weeks. A small trouble was coming, riding in from the east, a trouble that had less to do with the struggles of the land and everything to do with the cruelties of men. A few days later, a rider approached the Hale ranch. It was one of Silas Croft's men. He dismounted, a smirk on his face, and handed Jedediah an official-looking letter. "From Mr. Croft," the man said, his eyes flicking disdainfully towards the cabin, where he could just see Audrey through the open door. "Heard you picked up his cast-offs, Hale. He's got a proposition for you, too." Jedediah took the letter, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not a proposition. It was a threat. The war for his ranch and for his strange new family was about to begin in earnest. The letter from Silas Croft was not a proposition. It was a declaration of war wrapped in the thin veil of legalities. Croft held the note on Jedediah's land, a fact Jedediah was painfully aware of. The note was coming due in 30 days. The letter was a formal, predatory offer. Croft would graciously forgive the entire debt in exchange for Jedediah's deed to the ranch. It was, the letter smoothly implied, a generous offer for a piece of land so clearly failing, a way for Hale to walk away with his dignity intact. Jedediah read it, standing in the yard, the smug gaze of Croft's rider burning into his back. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood. Dignity. The word was a mockery. Croft wasn't just after his land. This was personal. It was a power play, a way to crush the man who had dared to claim the woman he had publicly discarded. "Tell Mr. Croft I'll have his money," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. He crumpled the letter in his fist. The rider laughed. "With what, Hale? You gonna dig for gold out here?" He swung back onto his horse. 30 days, the boss is looking forward to it. He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and derision in his wake. Jedediah stood there for a long time, the crumpled paper digging into his palm. The weight of his failure was crushing. He had known the note was coming due, had been praying for a miracle, for rain, for better cattle prices, for anything. But the world didn't run on prayer. It ran on money and power, and Silas Croft had both. He walked back into the cabin, his face a grim mask. Audrey was standing by the stove, her back to him, but he knew she had heard. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken questions. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice steady. Jedediah smoothed the crumpled letter out on the table. Jedediah said, the bitterness a raw wound in his voice. He slumped onto a chair, the fight draining out of him. "He's got me, ma'am. He's won." For the first time since her arrival, Audrey saw past the stoic cowboy to the desperate, frightened man beneath. The sight stirred something in her, a protective instinct she hadn't realized she possessed. She was tied to this man, to this land. His failure was her failure. Her future, which she had so desperately tried to secure, was about to be snatched away once more. "No," she said, the single word cutting through his despair. "He has not won. Not yet." She walked over to one of her trunks, the one she had kept locked since her arrival. She knelt and opened it. Inside, nestled amongst her few remaining books and sensible clothes, was a small, locked, rosewood box. She produced a tiny key from a chain around her neck and opened it. Jedediah watched, confused, as she withdrew a sheaf of papers tied with a faded ribbon. They were old, yellowed, and covered in a fine, elegant script. "What is that?" he asked. "My past, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Something I had hoped to leave behind me." She untied the ribbon and spread the papers on the table. They were letters, legal documents, a deed. "My name is not just Audrey Miller, it is Audrey Miller Prentice." The name meant nothing to Jedediah. My father, she explained, was Thomas Prentice. He was a partner in a shipping firm in Philadelphia, Prentice and Croft. Jedediah's head snapped up. Croft? The very same, Audrey confirmed, a grim look on her face. Silas Croft's father, Bartholomew, my father, and the elder Mr. Croft built the company together. They were friends, or so my father believed. When my father died unexpectedly, Mr. Croft, the senior, assured my mother and me that our shares in the company would provide for us for life. Her voice grew cold. He lied. Over the next few years, he used legal tricks and false accounting to systematically squeeze my mother out, devaluing her shares until they were worthless. He claimed the company was near bankruptcy while he was secretly funneling its assets into his own accounts. He ruined us. My mother died of a broken heart, and I, with my Prentice name, now a liability in Philadelphia society, was forced to become a governess to survive. I changed my name to just Miller to escape the whispers and the pity. She pushed one of the documents across the table. It was a letter from her father to her mother, written shortly before his death. In it, he happily detailed a new venture he and Bartholomew Croft were investing in out west. A massive tract of land purchased for cattle ranching in Texas, a silent partnership meant to be their share. I would wager my life that the money his father used to buy this land was my father's money. This ranch, and likely others Croft owns, was built on the foundations of a theft. Jedediah stared at her, dumbfounded. The quiet, plain woman he had married out of pity and desperation was a dispossessed heiress, and her enemy was his enemy. The world had suddenly, violently, tilted on its axis. "Can you prove it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "This letter is a start," she said, "but the proof would be in the company ledgers back in Philadelphia. Ledgers I am certain Silas would never allow anyone to see." She paused, her gaze turning inward. His father was a meticulous man, but he was also arrogant. He kept a private journal, bound in green leather. He wrote everything down. He once boasted to my father that his journal was his true history of his success. If Silas has it, a plan, audacious and dangerous, began to form in her mind. It was a wild gamble, a shot in the dark, but it was the only shot they had. "Mr. Croft is arrogant, like his father," Audrey said, her voice gaining strength. "He underestimates people he considers beneath him. He certainly underestimates you, and he has no idea who I am. He thinks I am just some pathetic spinster he shamed at the station." She looked directly at Jedediah, her grey eyes clear and sharp as flint. "He is hosting a large party at his ranch in 2 weeks, a celebration of his success, he calls it. The whole county will be there. He will want to gloat. And when men like Silas Croft gloat, they get careless." Jedediah saw the direction her thoughts were taking. "You want to go to his house? During the party?" "Not just go," she said. "We need to find that journal. His office, his study. It will be there. You know the layout of his ranch, do you not?" "I've delivered cattle to him before. I know the main house," Jedediah admitted, his mind reeling. "Burglary. He was a rancher, not a thief. It's not theft, to reclaim what was stolen," Audrey stated, as if reading his thoughts. "This is not just about saving your ranch, Mr. Hale. This is about justice, for my family and for yours." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw not the too-old bride, not the quiet servant, but a woman of incredible strength and intelligence, a woman who had been forged in the same fires of loss and injustice that he had. In that moment, something shifted between them. The wall of his grief, which had stood impenetrable for so long, developed a crack. He saw her not as a replacement for Mary, but as an ally, a partner. He thought of Sarah, of the promise of a future on this land. He thought of the smug— "All right, Mrs. Hale," he said, and for the first time he used her name. "Tell me your plan." The night of Silas Croft's party was moonless, the darkness a blessing. Jedediah and Audrey rode quietly, avoiding the main road, instead navigating shadowy arroyos to reach Croft's ranch unnoticed. Jedediah had traded his farmer's clothes for dark garments. Audrey surprised him with a practical riding outfit, hair braided neatly beneath a simple cap, looking more scout than governess. They tethered their horses in a mesquite thicket a half-mile away. The ranch house glowed brightly, music and laughter drifting through open windows, a display of arrogant confidence. "Croft's office is ground floor, west wing," Jedediah whispered. "There's a back window. He leaves it unlocked." "Men like Croft never think someone would dare enter," Audrey replied softly, eyes locked on the ranch. They crept along the perimeter, using shadows cast by outbuildings for cover, the revelry masking their careful footsteps. Reaching the window, Jedediah eased it open, slipping quietly inside before helping Audrey through. Inside, they paused, hearts pounding. The office smelled of leather and cigar smoke, the faint moonlight revealing an oak desk and bookshelves crammed with volumes and maps detailing Croft's empire. "Look for a green leather journal," Audrey whispered urgently. Jedediah searched desk drawers, finding contracts and deeds, but no journal. Audrey examined the shelves carefully, fingertips tracing spines until she spotted the out-of-place green leather notebook hidden high behind cattle breeding manuals. "There," she breathed, pointing. Jedediah quickly retrieved it, handing it to her. Audrey's hands shook slightly as she opened the book, recognizing Bartholomew Croft's handwriting, the same that had dismissed her so callously. Flipping quickly, she found an entry from 20 years before, revealing the truth clearly and bluntly. "Concluded the Prentice affair. Thomas's investment now fully mine. Widow and daughter cared for, but no burden. The land is mine, legacy mine." Audrey's heart soared. Proof at last. Suddenly, footsteps creaked outside the door. Jedediah grabbed Audrey, pulling her quickly behind the large desk just as Silas Croft entered, whiskey in hand. He muttered irritably about the open window, slamming and locking it, inadvertently trapping them. He lingered briefly, gloating over a letter on his desk, before party commotion drew him away, leaving the door ajar. The pair held their breath, relief flooding them as Croft's footsteps faded. "The window's locked," Audrey whispered anxiously. Jedediah scanned the room desperately, spotting a detailed map showing an abandoned storm cellar and tunnel beneath the ranch house. With the journal safely concealed, they slipped from the office, quickly reaching the pantry. Behind potato sacks, Jedediah discovered a trapdoor leading to the tunnel below. Quietly, they descended into darkness, following the damp passageway until a ladder brought them back to fresh air. Riding home in silence, dawn lightening the sky, they finally allowed themselves to breathe. Returning to the cabin, they found Sarah asleep, peaceful and unaware. In quiet triumph, the journal lay on the table between them. Jedediah, voice raw, confessed quietly, "Audrey, you saved everything." "No, we saved it together," she softly corrected. Jedediah saw her anew, not as a governess, but a woman of strength and compassion, someone he had grown to deeply respect. Mary's memory remained cherished but no longer overshadowed this new beginning. Tentatively, he reached across, clasping Audrey's hand firmly. "I was wrong," Jedediah admitted quietly. "I didn't think I could offer more than practicality, but what I feel is deeper, a respect that may grow into something stronger." Audrey's eyes filled with relief and hope. I believe it will." The next day, Jedediah rode confidently into Endurance, directly to the sheriff and the visiting judge, presenting undeniable proof. Silas Croft, exposed and cornered, quickly settled to avoid scandal. Jedediah's debt vanished, ranch deed returned, and Audrey reclaimed a portion of her stolen inheritance. Returning home, Jedediah found Audrey tending the garden, humming softly, Sarah quietly observing. Sharing the victory, Audrey's radiant smile lit her face, washing away past pains. That night, Jedediah moved Audrey's cot downstairs beside his own bed, a modest gesture symbolizing profound change, a hopeful new beginning. Soon, rains returned, nourishing the land, reviving creeks, and greening fields. Within the cabin, a family born of hardship and shared respect began to mend, the once oppressive silence now peaceful and comforting. It was home. And so, on the dusty plains where survival is the only law, a family wasn't just built on love, but forged in the fires of hardship, respect, and the quiet courage to start anew. The widower, the too-old bride, and the grieving daughter found that home isn't just a place you own, but something you build together, piece by painful piece. Their story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of desolation, a reminder that sometimes the most desperate bargains can lead to the most profound salvation. They proved that a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect can be just as strong, if not stronger, than one built on fleeting passion. If their journey from strangers to a family moved you, please give this video a like to help us share more tales from the Old West. Don't forget to share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an adventure, and tell us in the comments, what part of Jedediah and Audrey's story resonated with you the most?